Hi guys, welcome to our very last episode of season 2 of a BigLipz podcast. As always, my name is Kath Maurice, joined by my good friend Sam Macaulay Blair. For those who don't know, obviously at this stage, Sam pointed out before the podcast, we have now filled 2 entire days, over 48 hours worth of footage of us chatting about TV and film. Obviously, the first 24 hours was season 1 where when we only discussed a film and different elements of that, and then season 2 or series 2 we focused only on TV. So yeah, this is our last episode of season 2, and what better topic to go with than finales. So yeah, I thought it was a pretty good, just a nice way to round off the season. Normally Sam tends to go for the more thematically relevant topics, and I just pick one out of the blue, which was a possibility this episode, but then I did change my mind. So yeah, so to backtrack slightly as well, obviously, for those who don't know, we're both kind of we're former film students, kind of current independent filmmakers, and yeah, like I say, we just spend days on end discussing film and TV.
Actually,
yeah. So to start off with this one, Sam, what in your opinion would you say makes a good finale, whether that's a series finale or a season finale?
I'd say the answer kind of varies for both, but at the same time, resolution is probably the key word. And I guess with a season finale, which is obviously, for those who don't know, the difference between a series finale and a season finale is a season is like the entire show, whereas you have an individual series. Something like Friends has, I think, 9 individual series, but then the entirety of it would be the season. So the season finale would be the very last episode, and the series, whereas there would be like 9 different series finales. Yeah, I don't know why I picked Friends as an example, because I've not seen Friends. It was just the first thing that came to mind with a lot of series. But yeah, so I think with a season finale, you want closure. That probably is something you're gonna hope for, especially if you have watched something that is like nine series long.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think resolution is important because even individual series of a show usually do have arcs. They usually do have like story threads and sort of character development and ideas and themes that do kind of need to be brought to a head and do kind of need to be paid off. What's interesting about series finales is obviously I can get into that further down the line, but they do kind of serve a different purpose a lot of the time. You'll find, whereas like the overall season finale is there to really sort of bring everything together, and to I'm not saying they will like definitively end the story, because there are loads that don't, but it should feel like it should feel like a stopping point. It should feel like a place where you shouldn't finish it and go, oh, but like, when's the next episode coming? Don't get me wrong, like I'm sure there's plenty of season finales out there that we've all watched, and you want to know what happens next. You want to know where the characters go and what happens to the world, because you're so invested and you care. But yeah, generally it should work as it should be like a closing of the book, effectively. Resolution to emotional, narrative, thematic, and even philosophical questions, I think is an important thing, because usually a TV show will have a sort of philosophical conflict at the heart of it. I think season finales are very interesting for the fact that they kind of give you the shape of the show. They tell you what it's really about and where it lands. As the show's ongoing, it sort of is potentially repeatedly throwing this sort of philosophical debate at you, and then with its finale, it's kind of saying, okay, but this is where we land. Those are my sort of jumbled thoughts. What about yourself? What? Yeah.
I think very similar to you, but I think I kind of phrased it as this kind of sense of like finality, hence in the name. So much like you said, I feel like it doesn't necessarily need to tie up every single point that they make. Sometimes it works better when they don't, when there's a little bit of mystery and things like that. But they're definitely, I feel like obviously the difference between season and series finales that we'll kind of go into a wee bit more depth later on, but both of them have their own kind of like narrative structure, and generally speaking, stories will have a beginning, middle, and end. So you can have like within each episode, obviously there's the arc of the story, and then it's like a bigger version of that in the series, and then obviously the kind of main version of that in with like a season finale. So I feel like there is that kind of idea of more of a sense of finality and the conclusion, like you were saying. Yeah, because I feel like as well, we've spoken about this before, when you invest a lot of time in a TV show as well, you want it to feel almost like rewarding. Which, yeah, I suppose you could argue that, because like you would watch something because you're getting something out of it, do you know what I mean? So I feel like that it's kind of like, yeah, you could argue that it was like rewarding. But yeah, so pretty much, again, you were talking about your jumbled thoughts. Yeah, I feel like they need to be able to. I've written in my notes kind of like relevancy to the show, so it could work in some instances with particular genres of shows, and if you had a particular story. But I feel like it needs to be, and you kind of alluded to it too, where it needs to narratively kind of make sense with the story. If you watched several series or whatever, or even just like 10 episodes of a one season show, and it comes to the last episode and it's a completely different, it feels like a different show, that's going to be really jarring and really like unsettling and things. So that I feel like that should be I feel like that should be one of the kind of components of it as well.
Yeah, I had something similar actually in mind. I wrote that I think the premise for that last episode should really be the most sort of like quintessential, ideally the most interesting one they've ever done, but it should be the most quintessential that show premise. It should so just fit within, like, perfectly within that, like that, you could almost like use that last episode to define the whole thing and be like, yeah, that is what like an episode of the show should be. It should like be that
like that's what it should look like, that's what it should feel like.
That's not the time to experiment or really break new ground. It should really, like you say, really like stick to everything that is established, which, for some shows is a lot.
Yep, very true. In that kind of vein, what kind of elements do you think a good finale should avoid? If there's any like cliches or anything like that you would not want to see ideally?
I find that one quite difficult, because I don't. I couldn't really think, and again, we kind of talked amongst ourselves about this one, about the fact that we both have a bit of an issue with actually watching all these shows to like their conclusions. So there's probably a lot more shows I've seen than finales, and obviously there's the fact that some shows get cancelled and don't really get to do a finale. So there are significantly, we talked about pilots before, there's significantly more pilots in the world than there are finales, like by a considerable amount. And so
is that thing as well, sorry, like in terms of when you're talking about like investing a lot of time, especially like if you've got like a limited amount of time, if you work or whatever, you don't want to spend it watching something that you're not enjoying. Like why would you bother? Why would you risk all of that time to watch the last episode and for it to also be rubbish? Do you know what I mean? Or
exactly.
Something that you didn't enjoy, not necessarily rubbish, but something that you weren't enjoying.
Yeah, I think one of the problems and the pitfalls that I was kind of seen, and this isn't even like going as far as like talking about specific finales, but shows that I have like maybe fallen off on and haven't really bothered to see to their sort of conclusion or petering out of. Ones where, and this is a slightly unfair of me to say, but I think because it's not like the finale itself that is responsible for this and is the problem here, but shows where like your finale, your series, your entire season finale or series. I just realised I got that the wrong way around. The series is the whole thing. The season is the individual thing.
Just to confuse matters.
Yeah, there you go. Wondered why that was like sticking every time I said it. Yeah, so the entire like series finale. When you have a show that has a completely different cast by like its last episode than it did at the start,
Yeah.
I think you're in a really awkward place in terms of concluding it, because it's then really hard to make it feel like the same show that did, how much do you tie it back to that first episode, how much can you, and how much is it going to feel contrived, or so I think that's one to avoid, but again, it's not really the finale's fault. But I think you probably would. I think it would suffer more than any other episode in theory, because it obviously has to try and like conclude an entire show that it doesn't really have the means to. I think other ones are ones that kind of, I don't know, I guess go back on, and it goes back to, I guess, saying about like the philosophical conflict and where it lands, where like, the show lands on it, but there are finales that do feel like they kind of undo stuff that you've been invested in and cared about, and maybe don't necessarily do it in the most like impactful or meaningful way, but it does just kind of feel like, well, that was a waste of time, like, it was all for nothing, but not in like a sort of satisfying, oh, that was really tragic kind of way, but just in a kind of it just feels a bit sloppy.
Like that episode, I think we spoke about it on the Cliffhangers one. Neither of us have seen it, but we're both aware of that one. I think, is it Dallas, the TV show? Where can you imagine you had watched an entire season of a show and it turns out that none of that had actually happened, it was all a dream? You would be livid.
Exactly. It's stuff like that just feels like a surprise for the sake of, and that's actually an interesting point, is that neither of us said that we feel like finales should be surprising, and I think that they probably should be, but I think them being satisfying is more important than them being surprising.
Yeah. I think. Sorry, I was just quickly on that point. When I was doing like research and stuff for it, it became obvious that the surprising things tended to happen in the penultimate episode, and then the last episode was very much the resolution of that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. Yeah, it's well, the finales are kind of like a lot of housekeeping, aren't they? There's a lot of just like tidying everything up and making sure it's all left in a nice place. But yeah, I think those are probably the biggest ones that I could think of, that like things that have bothered me, like talking broadly in terms of like conceptual terms. When a show, I guess you could also say maybe just like outright ignoring to pay, like certain things, or like not fully paying them off, maybe just like referencing it with like a quick line, or like rather than actually something maybe you spent like a very long time invested in, or thinking about, or the show had left you on like a cliffhanger, because there's some, obviously you get, like we talked about cliffhangers before, and you get like direct cliffhangers, but you also do get sort of indirect ones where maybe something is left on a bit of a cliffhanger, one specific arc or note or plot thread, and it's not picked up again until the finale, and you kind of want it to feel like, if you've been wondering all this time, even though the show hasn't maybe spent a lot of time further developing it, you still want this, the resolution to be satisfying, and not just like an offhand kind of like, oh yeah, we don't even care about that. You don't want it to feel like the show doesn't care about that thing anymore, that it spent a long time building up.
Yeah.
What about yourself?
I think definitely like a similar kind of vein to that one is when like the writer seems to forget specific character traits or things like that, purely for like some kind of shocking moment. Especially like if you've watched seasons and seasons of a show, you can kind of develop, that's part of the enjoyment of film and TV, is that you can kind of develop like an understanding of the character, and obviously there'll be shocking moments and things like that, but there's some characters that are so developed, or even like they hit you over the head with their character traits, that something would happen and you think, that's not what that character would do. Like they've previously shown before in a similar situation they would do this. Why would they then suddenly do that? And it's not even like it's a character development or anything like that. It just seems like it's a mistake. Stuff like that always is very annoying, because it just instantly feels really lazy. Like the writers have been like, I want to do that, and then someone else has piped in and be like, oh, but that wouldn't make sense, remember? And they're like, no, we'll just do it anyway. Another kind of big one for me, and I don't know whether this is just because of maybe the type of shows, that I embarrassingly have watched all of. So shows like Grey's and Desperate Housewives, where they love like a huge amount of drama, and they by and large will kill off a character in the last and like the season finale. And Desperate Housewives is a really good one for it, where they would like make it very obvious that a character was dead, but they wouldn't reveal who it was. So it was just left on this massive cliffhanger, so that you had to wait for the next season. And yeah, again, it could be just the type of shows that I've seen examples of that in, but it feels it feels quite cheap, and it feels like a very easy way to get like to elicit like an emotional response, from the viewers, which is fine at times. Obviously, I don't expect, like, I don't want to constantly watch shows that are really clever, and do you know what I mean? Like, sometimes you do just want something that's just a little bit like a trashy drama.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like especially shows like that tend to have a lot of seasons, and when you've seen it again and again and again, it gets to the season finale and you're trying to suss out who's gonna die. Like it just becomes a cliche, even then within like the kind of fandom of it. Do you know what I mean? It's like
Was it?
Sorry.
Sorry, I'll let you finish the thought.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I was gonna an example, like a TV example of a terrible show, in my opinion. It's like when there's like the first 5 minutes of an episode of Casualty, and then it just introduces some character that we've never seen before, and there's like a shot of like a knife perched dangerously on a counter. Like, that's what it kind of becomes like, where you see these characters and they're all set up so that they could be in these horrible situations, so you're having to try and like Poirot it out to suss out who's gonna be. But yeah, sorry, what was your point gonna be?
Just on, I was just gonna ask, because you mentioned Desperate Housewives. Was it one of their season finales? Was it one of their season finales where they just did like a 5-year time jump? Was that? I know that they did do a time jump, but was that the finale that they did that? Like, that was like the cliffhanger effectively, or was it the next season, or was it even midway through?
Do you know what it was? I can't remember if it was at the end of a season, but there was a hurricane that that touched down at Wisteria Lane, and there was all these different characters were in all these different situations, and then I'm sure it started the next season with the 5-year time jump. And the funniest part is, I'm sure, if memory serves me correctly, it started on Gabby, who's played by Eva Longoria, and that's when she was fat. And that season when she was like fat and ugly because her husband was blind. I'm sure that's how it started. So yeah, that was a perfect example of it just being ridiculous.
I do remember, because I watched like a season or so of the show. I think I watched it with Mom for a bit, just weirdly, like, because that's like right in the middle of it as well. So
yeah,
I just have this like, I just know Desperate Housewives a bit because I've seen like a season or two of it right in the middle of the show.
In fairness to Desperate Housewives, it knows exactly what it is, and it does it very well. It is an entertaining show, much as I've slated it.
I very much enjoyed it, but I do remember at the time being a bit like genuinely surprised that they actually just did a 5-year time jump and then just committed to it. Like, I was just gonna say, like, I did respect the hell out of them for that one, because that's like that's an interesting thing to do. But yeah, whether or not it works or not is a different matter. And I get very much what you mean. I think, like, I guess, like, we talked about this with cliffhangers and stuff, but so many of them aren't there are all about just like drumming up water cooler chat and trying to generate. You want that buzz between the show, while the show's off the air. You want people, you give people a reason to come back, but you also want them to give them a reason to talk about it. And I think that's the big difference between like a season finale and a series finale. Is you want the speculation in between, in between individual seasons.
I definitely, like, you need people to want to come back. Another one Desperate Housewives did, when you were talking about that, there was a plane crash on the street, and there was like a love triangle going on at the time. So there was one of the housewives, and then her husband and the person she was having an affair with, and they were all in this like gingerbread house, and that's of course what the plane crashed into, and that's kind of how the season the season ended. and it was like the ruins of this gingerbread house. Now you just saw one character's hand, and then I'm sure the voiceover had made some comment about like not all of us are getting out of this alive, and then they just so yeah. In fairness to them, they would fully commit to their season finale. They must have known they were coming back for that next season. But yeah, I can't even remember how I got into that Desperate Housewives tangent.
Yeah, we really did go down the Desperate Housewives rabbit hole there. I was not expecting that, but
No.
like, we were talking about things for finales to avoid.
What they should avoid. I mean, I've said all these things, and I'm like, this is what they should avoid, and then immediately backtracked, but being like, but actually, that was really good. But in
It
fairness
worked
to
when they
Desperate
did it.
Housewives,
Don't do it again.
yeah, in fairness to Desperate Housewives, to tie it into the first point, it was very on brand for the show.
Yeah.
Like, had that, say you were watching, I can't even think of a good example of like a very serious show.
The West Wing. I've also never seen that.
Yeah, if you were watching that and then suddenly it ended with like a hurricane, do you know what I mean? Just destroying the offices. Then...
I now really want to look up and see if there is like a hurricane episode.
I know. I was trying to think of the most outlandish thing, and I was like, oh, a plane crash. I don't know if that would be too outlandish in a show like that.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah, but so moving on from our Desperate Housewives chat, I wanted to kind of talk about the difference between, obviously we've spoken kind of briefly about it, but the difference between what maybe like a season finale should do versus what a series finale should do. So obviously that would be the difference between the end of a season. So like, so it varies obviously with show, but like if you take a very basic example would be like a season would be like a year within the timeline of the show, and then the series would be like the final episode of the show. It's not going to air again after that. So yeah, what would kind of your thoughts be on that, the difference in what they should achieve or what they should try and achieve?
I think, well, this is, I guess, yeah, you can do a lot of things in a season finale that you can't do in the whole series finale, and like, I guess what you're talking about with like character maybe contradictions or like things that feel like character, you can get away with doing that in a season finale because it's then a hook almost. You know, if you have a character do something really like out there, then suddenly you're like, okay, I wasn't expecting that, and now you're kind of sitting forward and you're interested in seeing, you know, a character has an affair or killed someone, just to go for like the really extreme examples. But you know, if a character does suddenly display these qualities that you haven't seen them display, then it does feel like an intentional thing, and you are then thinking, okay, well, I want to see what they're setting up, because that what a individual season finale generally seems to do is it will like pay off the sort of like threads of that individual and sort of themes and stuff of that individual season, but it will also usually kind of be a launch pad for the next season. You know, usually be like, okay, this is the direction we're going to go, and it's a course, we're changing course basically, and hopefully it's something interesting, and there'll usually be like, you know, sort of dangling threads left so that you want to come back, and you want to discuss and you want to speculate. Some shows do this better than others, and some could be quite cheap with the way they do it. Some like just will have things that never get paid off. Looking at you, heroes. And yeah, but it's, yeah, I think they're quite, you know, individual series finales I look forward to, because, you know, they'll also will generally be like quite high stakes and, you know, really dramatic, and there'll be a lot going on. You know, they're very bombastic. That's kind of where, because, you know, you want to market the hell out of it, and you want it to feel like, you know, this is the most exciting the show's ever been, so that you're also remembering it on a high. But yeah, like shows like, even, you know, something like Sherlock, which, you know, it only has 3 episodes, so the finale is just a third of the show. But I always really look forward to like seeing, okay, well, what note are they going to leave? What's the cliffhanger going to be? What note are they going to leave this series or season off on? I think there was something quite exciting about watching it when, you know, you knew that there's probably going to be a big juicy cliffhanger or a big twist to come in the episode, whereas like the actual overall series finale is more about like that resolution and that closure, and it's about like, it will usually, you know, it will be a sort of maybe more muted, like introspective episodes.
Yeah.
Rather than so that it will be. Usually, I think, not always, but like a lot of times they can be smaller scale episodes, actual series finales. So they kind of go against the grain that they've established. But yeah, what about you? What are differences that you've sort of noticed?
I feel like one that I kind of wanted to talk about straight away was like with a full series finale, like you were saying, sometimes because of the kind of smaller scale of it, it feels a lot more like almost like the writers are writing it for themselves as well as the viewers. Do you know what I mean? If you think of examples, one example that I saw when I was looking at was ER, and it was a show that ran for a while, and there was a lot of there was a huge cast kind of throughout the time, and the series finale made a point of kind of going back to each of even like some of them were big names, like one of them was George Clooney, and like he was in it. They went back to revisit him and what happened with his character, and it was very fleeting, but it was just nice for it to it definitely had that kind of very much like finality of it, where it felt like they were rounding everything up and it was just like a nice kind of like closure almost. So I feel like that's a kind of common thread for like series finales, but I feel like with season finales, sorry god, who knew this episode would be quite as tongue twistery.
Yeah, no, it is a bit like, it's difficult to keep track.
So like season finales tend to be a bit more, like you're saying, like a bit punchier and a bit more high stakes potentially. Obviously because they've got time in the following seasons to deal with the backlash of that and to kind of, like, I feel like it would be really ballsy to do it, but if you ended a series with like some kind of major big event and stuff like that, it would feel, unless you did it very carefully and unless it fit with the kind of theme and like history of the show, it would feel really like, I don't know, I feel like it just wouldn't sit right. Do you know what I mean? Like if there's a difference between something being left purposely like kind of open so that it's up to interpretation, than something to just be like the Desperate Housewives things. Like if that was the end of this series, there's nothing that, like, there's not open to interpretation. You would just have to guess like who was the person that died. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I feel like seasons, like you were saying, season finales obviously they've got the scope to finish the story later on, so they can leave it a lot more open, and they can kind of leave a lot more things for you to discuss, like you were saying. So I feel like for a series finale, it's definitely just this much more of a sense of it being complete almost. Do you know what I mean?
One thing that I just thought of or remembered there is another thing that, like, series, it seems to be more of a thing I've seen like with newer shows, but there does seem to be a thing now where shows will have, like, it won't just be the last episode that's effectively the finale. There'll kind of be like a series of endings. You know, they will start to like wrap up things in the last few episodes, and so which can work really well, or it can not, because I think it's a difficult thing to do, because you do kind of want there to be some momentum to keep you watching those last few episodes. You don't want it to just feel like an endless epilogue. But at the same time, it means that you can give more satisfying endings. An example of one that we have discussed in this podcast before is Derry Girls, where the finale does kind of wrap everything up, but it did also feel like the last couple episodes before that did also kind of feel like payoffs, and sort of we talked about the episode on the parents sort of feeling like a bit of closure on those characters, and then obviously there was like a death in the second last episode, and so it did kind of feel like, okay, when it wasn't used as like a cliffhanger, it was used as like an emotional beat, so it did kind of feel like the show was like, you were in the final sort of stage of the show, and then it meant that also then means that the final episode is a bit more free to kind of like fully round off the things that it wants to round off.
Yeah, that's such a good example as well, because obviously like you were saying, the parents episodes, it really nicely like kind of closes off their side of the story so that we can solely focus on the girls, and I can't remember the guy's name now,
James.
that's terrible. James and the girls and James. So yeah, that was a super interesting example. But yeah, I feel like it's funny because it does just feel like a series finale is just much more about closure for me anyway, or like this kind of sense of obviously ending. Do you know what I mean? But to try and I'm not. I think a very coherent point, but
no, I mean I noticed that I think the best series finales kind of leave you feeling a bit bereft by the end of it.
Yeah.
You know, there is a sadness to it because you lost the show that you spent so much time with. So yeah, I think that's pretty fair.
Yeah. So next, we'll just jump right in with some of our favourites. So yeah, by the way, Sam, this could be favourite series or season finales. So I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are.
I mostly just put overall series finales. My God. Yeah, just because I feel like that is the meat of the discussion here. I think the more interesting one is the whole overall conclusion. Because I guess like series finales, we talked about this. There's maybe a bit more overlap with the conclusion stuff that we talked about. But yeah, I mean, you probably beyond sick of hearing me talk about this by now and saying it, but Better Call Saul.
Is it Better Call Saul?
It's Better Call Saul. I absolutely adored the way that wrapped up. Breaking Bad as well has a fantastic finale, and that's one of those ones where the writers came out and said, you know, they see that with both shows it's like a series of, you know, it's not just the finale isn't just the last episode. The finale is like, I mean, with Better Call Saul, it really did feel like the whole final season was it had that kind of feel. I mean, Bob Odenkirk had a heart attack when they're filming it as well. So there's high stakes on camera and off camera. But yeah, that one for me was just so beautifully done. And again, because like I said about it giving a shape to the show, it landed in the exactly the shape that I felt like it should have, without me even realizing that I felt that way. Because I genuinely, that's one where I remember when I was going into it. It was weird because Breaking Bad, going into it, I remember having just caught up basically just before the last few episodes of Breaking Bad and being part of the speculation stuff online, or just the online chatter with the last one, which I was for all of Better Call Saul. But it was interesting because with Breaking Bad, and this is what going back to talking about surprises versus satisfaction, I remember when it came to the last episode, people had pretty much been like, these are probably the things that, you know, are going to happen and I want to happen, and there was a bit of a consensus on that, and the show kind of just delivers on those notes. There's a couple of small bits here and there that people didn't really see coming, but for the most part people kind of figured out what was going to happen, and it was very satisfying, but it wasn't you know, I knew what to expect going in, and then it just delivered on that as beautifully as it did. Better Call Saul, going into the last episode, I remember thinking, I was like, I actually don't know, I have no idea what they're going to do with this. And then as soon as I was watching it, I was like, of course that's what they've done with it.
Yeah.
And it was just such a wonderful feeling. But yeah, so I had to shout out Better Call Saul. Another one, which I've mentioned to you I think before, I haven't talked about heaps, is the TV series Dark, the German TV series, which is another one that's just it's 3 seasons, it's a German show, and it just it's actually kind of crazy. And again, it's another one where the finale is the finale, and it is very much different to you know, it does conclude it does all the things that we talked about basically. But there's so many, that show is such just the planning that must have been involved in designing it and actually pulling it off is just something to behold, and it's one of those ones that I've only come to appreciate it more and more after watching it, because I went online and read I love reading the sort of discourse around it, and you always pick up things that you've missed, just from other people have noticed, whether that be symbolism or you know, stuff like that, or little callbacks, or sometimes like actual like connective like tissue and things that were set up and paid off. And yeah, that one just genuinely blew my mind
Yeah.
for like the way that just the way that it like was clearly must have been so meticulously planned, and it does deliver this like satisfying payoff, but also it just it was really really well done. Very different one, one that you will definitely, you're not seen, but you wouldn't agree with if you had. It was Legion.
Okay,
Which
that's so funny because you were talking earlier about when shows have a lot going on throughout, and that was the one that, no joke, like immediately popped into my head. Was and Jane, like fleeting thought, like, oh god, what was you even do there?
well, that's the thing with Legion, is you could make the argument that there's loads that isn't, because the show throws so much at the wall, but it felt to me like the sort of core emotional story is wrapped up, and that is what the show was about. And again, it gives it a shape. It sort of tells you what the story was always about, and it does kind of leave you thinking, okay, well, that actually, it left me thinking, I was like, that was exactly the note I feel like it needed to end on, and it does have this sort of sense of finality, but it also doesn't stress over like, oh, we set this tiny thing up, or we had this moment and we need to tie everything together in a nice perfect bow. It's a very messy show, and it's a very stylized show, and it ends on that note as well. But it did feel very much like a proper payoff, and it did feel like a sort of fulfillment of like the sort of journey that the show goes on. So yeah, that was one that I loved. Fleabag, again.
I'm sorry.
I know. That one is also a cheat, 'cause I also, I'll probably mention that again in a moment. So I won't really dwell on it just now. Another one, it's like all just shows that you've not seen. Atlanta, which I only just watched the conclusion of the other day, and that was another one. Again, I really liked what they did with the last episode. I would say it's like an unconventional one, but they really made it work. It also is a very unconventional show, so it does fit sort of style. But yeah, no, I really, really dug the Atlanta one. I obviously talked about Dairy Girls, so I just wanted to shout out to Dairy Girls.
If you're listening.
And yeah, the girls are watching. And another one that it's been like the last 12 months have been like quite good for me in series finales. His Dark Materials. Granted, that's obviously based on a book, and I knew how that was going to end. But yeah, like I didn't think it was. I did really like the show. It wasn't quite as good as I'd hoped it would be. But they really do think they nailed the ending. And the ending of the books is so good. But yeah, like it was crazy. It was just really, it really delivered. It was like, it was funny because I read it when I was like 12 years old, and I remember having this really like emotional sort of experience reading it, and then watching it again now, even knowing what was going to happen, it really did land emotionally, I thought. And it was really cool to sort of revisit that experience in a different medium and at a different age. So yeah, his Dark Materials, I thought like really did sort of pay things off nicely. Those are probably the main ones because I feel like I've talked for ages.
That's fair.
What about you?
So pretty much when I was, like we had said, I was trying to do research and stuff for this, and I was like, Jesus, there's very few shows that I've seen the entire series of, and then to whittle that down to ones where I've like that I can recall the series finale. I feel like that's another kind of telltale sign when like of a good one, is when you can actually, when you think back and think, that's memorable, or I guess I can remember what happened. So I've cheated and gone for season finales. However, the first one I want to talk about, I only did read today that it was renewed. So at the time of my writing, it was a series finale. And that is specifically the final episode of season 2 of the White Lotus. And I won't go into too much detail, obviously, because I'm hoping that you'll watch it. But
Me too.
this one, it felt a lot more. The entire kind of series felt a lot more dramatic, maybe, than the first season, which is funny because it's not like a outrageously dramatic show. I mean, it is, but not in like a show off kind of in your face way.
Yeah.
But it kind of like I felt like it tied in, even though it's by and large a new set of characters. It very much tied into the first season. I feel like that's the writing in both seasons is so clever, and one of my favorite parts of it was what was kind of addressed in the kind of end note of season one. Was kind of flipped on its head for season two, but it was done in a nice kind of subtle way where it wasn't until I was talking to my mum about it where I was like, oh yeah, do you know what, that's right. Like I had just finished it and I'd texted her to tell her no, I'd seen it. And she brought up the point that it had kind of flipped on its head. And I was like, oh yeah, God, it's so clever. It's so well done that it doesn't feel gimmicky or anything like that. And there was both seasons start in the same way where there's like a dead body, basically. You don't see who it is or anything like that. And then it jumps back and the story's revealed, but it's done in such a nice way where it's not a murder mystery. Like you watch all the episodes and you almost forget that that's how it started until it gets to later on. And season 2 especially was like right up until the last chap where you found out what had happened. There were a few like kind of like red herrings throughout, which again it just wasn't so glaringly obvious. Like it was so subtly done, and then like I said, like you were watching it and you weren't thinking about how it had started. Like occasionally some things would happen and you'd be like, oh, is this it? And then it wouldn't be it, and then like the actual conclusion of it was such a nice way where it was kind of a surprise, but it didn't feel outlandish. Like it felt like it could have happened. Like they'd written it so well throughout that looking back, everything that happened made sense.
Out of curiosity, just because you mentioned it at the start of you talking about it, would you have been happy if that had been the series finale? Like if that had no more White Lotus after that?
Well, I think I was reading they're just gonna it was renewed for season 3, but it's gonna be like a kind of anthology, which it kind of mostly was.
Yeah, I thought it was an anthology show.
Yeah, so there's I feel like there's so much scope with it. Like the thing that's kind of tying them together is this chain of hotels, obviously called the White Lotus. The first season's in Hawaii, the second season's in Sicily, so there's scope for them to just go anywhere, do you know what I mean? But I feel like had that been, I think I wouldn't want it to go any further than 3 seasons, and I think because it started its life as a one series mini-series, I feel like there is scope for it to kind of spiral, do you know what I mean, into something that I don't think it should be.
Yeah,
I feel like
less is more.
100%. Like even in terms of like the plot, like especially of the first season, like people were asking what it was about, and I'm like, because it's so, like it's much more about like the kind of what it's like the message and in the non-preachy way, like the kind of message that it's trying to display to get across. And it is a non-preachy way because they're not like, oh, this is what's happening and it's bad. They're like, this is what's happening and that's it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I feel like any more than 3 seasons, it's going to be a bit. There's definitely scope for it to become repetitive, which is not ideal. But I feel like that works as its own season finale, and a series finale because it manages to kind of bring it round from the first season as well.
Yeah. Good to know. Just to jump on, and this is just a completely different point,
Uh-huh.
but just because you'd mentioned anthology series, I just feel like, how do you think there's a difference? Do you think I know there's a difference between anthology series and like a series, but like if talking about finales, talking about season finales, and I guess more importantly series finales, how do you think anthology series should handle like series finales? Because I know that you obviously we talked about American Horror Story before, which do you still watch? Are you still watching?
Yeah.
Keeping up to date with? Yeah. So like something like American Horror Story, how do you feel like the final episode of that, or another one, Black Mirror? You know, how do you feel like the final episode of Black Mirror? Do you think there should be like an obligation for it to tie things up, like, or at least like connect to other things, like something like Black Museum, or do you think it's better off just being a standalone story?
I feel like that's a hard one because obviously American Horror Story got to a point where they just started. It's almost like a game now to figure out how some of the characters in each season are related to different characters.
Yeah.
So I feel like if a show like American Horror Story has to go back to, I feel like American Horror Story would be good if it went back to its like murder house roots, because even when there was the kind of I can't think of the word, like the like side series of American Horror Story, which was American Horror Stories, which
Oh, the spin-off.
spin-offs, there we go. There was 3 or 4 episodes about the murder house, so it's such like a, that's obviously where it started. I feel like with American Horror Story at this stage, they're kind of, because they've done it so much throughout, they're kind of obligated to somehow tie them all together. But a show like Black Mirror would be much more difficult because I feel like it's committed more to the kind of anthology element of it.
Do you think it should though? Do you think, would you feel satisfied or would you feel unsatisfied if the final episode came and it was just another episode of Black Mirror?
I don't know. I feel like that's a hard one. I feel like Black Mirror is such an interesting show as well that they could, I feel like they maybe not call back specific moments or specific episodes, but if they kind of called it back to different themes and things like that, which obviously they kind of do. They've got like a kind of overarching vibe.
That's one where, I mean, they've already done it now, but that's one where it might have actually been really interesting if they did something a bit different for the last episode. So, you know, obviously, like, remember when San Junipero, was it season 3, season 4, season 3, I think, that had San Junipero in it? And that was, like, the only episode of Black Mirror that ended on, like, a sort of happy note.
Yeah.
Like, if that, you know, if that had been the last episode and that had been the only time they ever did that, I feel like that, despite everything that we've said, but just because of, like, the way that show in particular works and the way that those types of shows work, actually going against its grain, going against what it normally does, makes it more interesting and makes it then gives it some emotional weight as well, I guess, is the thing. That it then makes it feel like, okay, that episode was, because that's the difficult thing, isn't it? And I guess you could ask, is there even a need for it to feel like a finale? But if you wanted it to feel different and distinct and feel like it had a different scope to the rest, would be a way of doing it.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I didn't even think about it. Honestly, I feel like my brain's like broken now.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, it was a really As soon as I was asking it, I was like, it's a bit unfair to just throw this at you, but it just came to mind, so I wanted to ask it.
No, fair. Interesting point though. Like, especially something like Black Mirror, like where it's, because every episode obviously is different. It's not even like. Yeah. And like American Horror Story, obviously you go through the entire season and then it changes, so there's a lot more scope to like bring different elements in. So yeah, that's a good one to think about. Honestly, that'll be keeping me up tonight.
You will.
But yeah, another to jump back to like favourites, another one that I wanted to mention, which I think I've spoken about before, was the season finale of season 4 of Orange is the New Black. And I chose this one specifically because this is the one, the season before the riot. I don't even think you've seen this far, have you?
No, I've seen season 1.
You've seen okay.
Sorry, no.
So yeah, so basically this is like we were talking about, the penultimate episode is the episode where the kind of major event happens. And then I really like this one as a season finale because the kind of main event that happened just acted as like the catalyst for something else, which it kind of took away from that thing that I was talking about earlier, where like the death of a character has kind of become a cliche. Whereas this, they had the death of a character, and then that wasn't the main story. They used that to kind of highlight the or to like fully reinforce the point that they had been making throughout the entire season. And I thought that was a really interesting way to do it. And then obviously I spoke about that before because that's the one that ends on a cliffhanger with Daya, where she's got the gun pointed in that guy's face. So somehow it did have like, it had all the drama, but it didn't at the same time.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like it just struck a really nice balance of kind of including those cliches, but not in the way that you would normally expect them to be there. Yeah. So those were kind of my choices for that. In terms of moving on, to swing the opposite direction, what have you got any examples of your least favourites or potentially the most disappointing?
I mean, there's a big one that we'll probably talk about in a second. We have talked about before. But I guess to try and maybe pick up ones that wouldn't have I think, did you watch they did like a mini series? Stephen Moffat did a mini series, basically stylized the same way as Sherlock but with Dracula, and it's literally just 3 episodes and it's the full story, and it just kind of came and went. It was weird. I mean, yeah, it had a lot less fuss and fanfare than Sherlock. And I think just because it is a one-off thing, and I don't think they'll go back to it.
I think I do remember when it was out. Was it quite scary? Like, scarier than?
Yeah, I mean, Moffat's quite good with horror, and they did kind of lean into the sort of gothic horror and stuff like that, and that was basically the first 2 episodes of it were utterly fantastic, and then the third episodes, they do some interesting stuff.
Okay.
And yeah, it's really weird because it just I just didn't think it. I don't think anyone really thought it worked that well.
Okay.
And there's like a central sort of question that the show keeps repeating, and it's a really interesting question. And then I just thought the answer was just really lame as well, so that kind of didn't help it. And it also ends. It does kind of like the note it ends on does kind of like, it does kind of say this is just like the story told, but it also somehow, I think it just kind of felt a bit abrupt. It just, from what I remember it just kind of being like, is there going to be a season 2? Because it felt like didn't feel like that was it done, but also it kind of is it done at the same time. Like,
that's funny as well, because Dracula is a funny one to choose because obviously it's been adapted so many times. Like, it's difficult to be like, especially in 3 episodes, what are you going to bring to it that's going to be like, that's going to be interesting and different? Do you know what I mean? Especially with the story, like, I don't know if you've read the book, but the book is scary. Like, you don't need to do anything on top of the book story. Do you know what I mean? So it's a weird one to.
They do. I think for the first episode in particular, I think they stick quite closely to the source material. I think the second one is maybe where they start to deviate a bit more. Don't get me wrong, there are deviations. I say without having read it, but I think just from the fact that like a lot of the stuff in the first episode, I was like, okay, I know this to just be part of like the Dracula story. It didn't feel like there was a lot of deviation, like not tons anyway. And I remember reading interviews and stuff and them talking about loving the book and the sort of importance of the text and stuff like that. So I think they do kind of stick to, I think they just kind of veer off more and more as they go, which I guess makes. Talking about Dracula, cat.
I know. I'm sorry. It's a cat.
No, it's fine. It's like perfectly timed. So, yeah, it's just when they kind of do their own thing, and the more they put their own spin on it, I just didn't think it worked as well. So that was an unfortunate, because again, and I think because it's just the 3 episodes, I've just never gone back and rewatched it. Because like, it just almost doesn't feel worth the time. You can there are some shows that like can end on a poor note, but you would still go back to them because you're like, well, there was so much before that. Worked.
And that's a very bad sign that it was only 3 episodes and you're like, nah, I'm not gonna watch that again.
Yeah, exactly. So that was one. Another one was the show Years and Years, which I don't think ended terribly. But that one's Russell T Davies, and I absolutely love his writing.
Mm-hmm.
You think he's absolutely fantastic. Also wrote for Doctor Who, so there's a theme here. But you kind of saw it in his Doctor Who finale sometimes, was he could go in some. I just think sometimes he takes things in like not amazing directions in his finales, and maybe like stretches credulity a bit too far. And Years and Years was one where it kind of felt like it did a bit of a leap. I'm not sure that like the way that it did, I didn't really like all, and you could disagree with the way that something's done, but I just didn't feel like it delivered in the best way on like all the stories it sort of had going with its characters, and I just remember that being one where I was really, really enjoying it, like really enjoying every episode, and then it kind of finished, and I was like, okay, that's a shame, because it looked like they'd nailed that.
Yeah.
And then, the big one would be Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Which is just, and I don't even think it's the last episode that's the problem. I think it's just that the last, we talked about this before, but it's just it just kind of feels like it's bleeding out as it goes.
That's such a good way to describe it.
And it's such a shame because so much interesting stuff. But that was, I was very much hinting at Game of Thrones earlier as well when I was talking about undoing certain things, and like Jamie Lannister is like maybe one of the most like famous or infamous examples of just like goodbye character development.
Exactly. Character development. Who is she?
And again, it felt like they thought they were doing it, and it felt like they were going for like a whole it's tragic that he's not actually changed, he's still the same person, but it didn't play that way. It does just feel like a lazy way to sort of like wrap the character up. So that one just felt like a mess, and just like it felt like you had like again, I remember reading a comment online years before Game of Thrones wrapped up saying how it was naive to think that the show was going to end with someone just sitting on the Iron Throne and that being the payoff, which makes sense because like the whole show is about whoever's in the Iron Throne is like they're marked for death basically, and it's like so it wouldn't really be ending it to just have someone sit on the Iron Throne and have that be the sort of like just that's now it's happily ever after. This time they get it right, but then they kind of just do that with Bran.
With Bran of all people. Like, Bran stopped being interesting literally after he fell out the window.
I was going to say, I was going to go, how far back you going here? Because, like, that was the most interesting thing that ever happened to him, was getting pushed out that window. He peaked.
100%. Oh, God, and he just got worse and worse as the series went on. Obviously, Game of Thrones was one of my choices. And, like you were saying, like, I feel like the most boring... So we've, up until this point, you've watched 8 seasons of a show where apparently no character's safe. Everyone is marked for death. It's all just fighting. Everyone is fighting, like physical fighting for the Iron Throne, backstabbing and scheming. And then for it to be sided while they just sit in a line. Yeah. Like, just sit calmly in a line. And like you're saying, it does make sense for it not to be a big battle and then for some heroic person to come out through the bloodshed and sit on the Iron Throne. It makes sense for it to be like a kind of decision. But it was just painfully boring. And then for them to choose Bran of all people, yeah, it just, and like, yeah, I've spoken about it before, and I've spoken to death, but I've got a lot of issues with the acting in Game of Thrones. And then for it to be like, oh yeah, it's Bran, king of who, whatever. And then for Bran to just be sitting there, like, completely chilling, like, oh god. Yeah. There's a lot of issues with it show, and like you said, it's not confined to the final episodes.
I think
Yeah.
I can't remember if we mentioned this or not in the House of the Dragon podcast, but I think even just the fact, because they announced, and it might not even be happening anymore because HBO is just doing its like mental thing that it's doing. But like, there was like the Jon Snow spin-off that was recently announced, and about like taking place after, and I feel like, in many ways Jon Snow was like the main character, or he was one of like a very like small core, and the fact that you not you can do spin-offs and stuff. I'm not saying that you can't, especially something as sprawling as Game of Thrones, but it feels like if there's a need to do a spin-off of like your main character after the end of the show, then you didn't really end the show, did you? Like,
Yeah.
you haven't wrapped that
100%.
one up. Which is the thing that, I mean, I don't really, if they make it, House of the Dragon's really good, so maybe it'll be amazing, but I don't have any like appetite for a Jon Snow
Yeah.
show. I feel like, we gave you 8 seasons of our invested time and care, and you didn't pay us off there. So
Yeah, Jon Snow's another one, and like he's up there with Bran, like the most boring characters.
yeah,
Like, yeah, I don't have any more in me to to watch it. Do you know what I mean? I feel like it's one of those shows where I've watched the series finale and I've had very little thought for it since. Do you know what I mean? Other
yeah.
than disappointment. Do you know what I mean? It's not like I'm like, oh god, I can't believe that show's ended, or I'm dying to rewatch or whatever. No, that's not the case. Um, so for me, another one I wanted to mention was The Watcher. Admittedly, this is not, the show overall wasn't my favorite. It wasn't the best, but um, for me, it felt like it was like a first draft. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
they didn't even attempt to wrap things up. There was some things they kind of like half presented, like, oh, this is a plot point, and then just completely disregarded. Didn't even try to back it up. Yeah, so it felt like everything was at best half-heartedly pulled together, and they made such a big deal about it being like based on a true story and that. So I had kind of looked it up afterwards, and they were just clutching at straws for this story. It was barely a story. Like the family didn't even move into the house. Like they received like 2 letters, I think it was. So obviously there wasn't a huge amount of
I love that you totally called his bluff there as well.
yeah.
Like, where are you based on a true story? I'm gonna check.
Of course, I was like, how much of this is fact? Not a thing. Let me tell you. um, yeah, I feel like it wasn't like I didn't have huge high hopes for it because the show was like it was just keeping me watching. And yeah, the final episode I was watching it and I was like, right, okay, that ended about slightly worse than I expected. um, and then funny that you should have mentioned American Horror Story, because for me the last episode of the American Horror Story season 1984 was one that
When
just
you
was,
when you said that there, I thought that was like the number. I was like, how many seasons of American Horror Story have they done?
wow, that would be amazing. um, no, I feel like when we spoke before about what they should avoid and things like that. So up until this point, we've watched the whole season. We've got the characters that we have been introduced to, that have been developed, that we know, and there's a few time jumps in that season. So we've seen them through different spans of time, and then literally the last beat of the season is one character that is mentioned very briefly as a baby, and then they come back and they're not really relevant to the story. I've never spared a thought for the character. I'll just tell you because you're probably not going to watch it because I know you're not a fan. So basically, there's this like crazed killer in the woods. Um, Spoiler alert: turns out they're actually the good guy, and they've had a child at some point before they were arrested or murdered or whatever. So I can't even remember. But yeah, but the series ends with this the killer's child, who's now a grown man, and then they try and make the last episode all about him, but they don't leave themselves half as much time as they need to make it in any way even engaging. And it felt like it's just that way I was like almost angry on behalf of the other characters, but I'm like, where's their resolution? Why are we seeing a resolution for a character that we've never seen, that we don't care about? Do you know what I mean? His story was probably the worst part of it, and he's the one that gets all the like the kind of final shot and the final beat of it. And that was one of those things where I was like, why did you do that? Like, stick with the characters that we've seen the whole time. Fair enough, introduce new characters. That wouldn't really work in an anthology, but like when shows introduce new characters in the final episode so that they can have something to jump off of in the next season. But yeah, that was one that just, and I was watching it with my bestie at the time, and that baby turned around and was like, why have they ended it with him? Like, it just felt so weird. Yeah, so after that angry rant, obviously there will have been times where it's maybe not necessarily been a bad ending, but there's been points where there's been like a missed opportunity for maybe changes in a specific episode or like a whole So what are your thoughts on that? Do you have any examples?
So yeah, I do actually. I think there's a few shows that have. I think it's interesting. There's a few shows that have, and have episodes that could actually just serve as an ending, or could have served as an ending, and then the show's maybe continued. This kind of feels like a cheat to say, and but it is relevant to the discussion. But In-Betweeners have their series finale, but then they did a movie like immediately after to kind of wrap everything up, and did, I thought, like a perfect job. Like they absolutely nailed it. And then they did a sequel, and it was fine, but it undoes like this really good ending that all these characters get and leaves them in a different place. And it's just like, why did you do a second one? Like, you just you're
right. The first one was just a perfect ending. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And now it just goes on that one story too far, basically. And it's just very frustrating. And don't get me wrong, like you can just not watch the second film, but it is just kind of annoying they've done that, because it's to have a good ending and to then come back for more and kind of squander it. Just is a shame. Another one, I've got two examples here that are like kind of similar. They're both animated, so they're similar in that sense. American Dad has an episode of basically where I stopped watching it. They have an episode where it kind of Stan basically goes to heaven, and he goes through a door, and it's revealed that his heaven is just like the way his life was before. And then the sort of implication is like, well, that's just what the show is now. It's just him in heaven, and he's content. And that's for me, I was like, do you know what? They're probably never going to give the show an actual ending, so that works as an ending, and it's just a nice sort of sentimental uptick to sort of end on. And I
especially for a character like Stan, who's just a horrible character, and he's horrible to everyone in his family at all times. It's such a nice, like, just a nice moment.
It's sort of like redeeming him at the very end. The other animated show that's kind of similar, it's kind of a cheat as well, because I don't even have a specific episode to reference. It just shouldn't still be going, and that's The Simpsons. And I guarantee there's like an episode in there somewhere in the last like decade at least, if not longer, that would have worked perfectly well as a final episode. I think there actually was an episode in the last year that came out. I'm sure I remember seeing a review online somewhere. I didn't read it or anything, but just I read like a snippet of it, and it mentioned that it actually would have been a really nice like conclusion to the show. So yeah, Simpsons just absolutely should have had.
Yeah, it's just, yeah. I think I stopped watching, I don't watch anything after like season 9, and I think they're on like, what, 27 or something now?
I think something
like that's
mental
almost
like that.
20 seasons that I refuse to watch because they're god awful.
Yeah, yeah, I know. It's wild when you think about like the actual proportion of like how much you've seen versus how much you won't see, and how much is good versus how much is bad. Yeah, it's nuts. Yeah, so please, I know it's just been renewed for another couple of seasons as well.
Oh, no. It's never ending. It's going to be going on longer than we're alive at this stage.
This is a very dangerous thing to bring up now because it's run the risk of launching into a whole other podcast here. But one thing that would be interesting is, for a number of reasons, but it would be interesting to see what happens with Rick and Morty now that they're recasting those characters, because that might also dictate how long The Simpsons goes on for as well.
Yep. Because The Simpsons in the past has kind of written out characters who the voice actor has died. But yeah, if it works for Rick and Morty, then they'll be like, yes.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
So yeah, the Simpsons writers probably are paying attention. Like, actually, I wonder how that's going to be.
That's a good shout.
Yeah. And then last one I kind of wanted to mention, or actually two that I wanted to kind of mention, but they're again related to one another. Is Doctor Who and Torchwood. Not that I think Doctor Who should have ended. I love that it's ongoing, but there are just some really nice episodes in there that do kind of work, and that again is a weird one because it's kind of it's not like an actual anthology.
Mm-hmm.
It does have like, you know, it's the same character that was in the very first episode, but
it's like
it does
Bond-esque, isn't it?
yeah. There's like a continuity, but it does reboot it reboots kind of everything as it goes. So, and the whole premise of the show is designed to just be infinite, effectively, which is what I love about it. I think it's probably the best premise a TV show has ever had, maybe ever will have, for that fact that it just can go on forever.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's just some really nice episodes in there. Like one of the Christmas specials just pays off. It basically concludes this. I think it was like an 8-year story that they had. Not that it was told like a normal show would tell a story. It was done out of order, and it was every like, you know, you never really knew when that character was going to reappear, and they were going to like continue to develop that storyline. But yeah, they did a Christmas special, and they kind of like concluded that, and it was just a really nice note for it to end on. I mean, the show has kind of multiple endings because obviously actors leave and showrunners leave, and so as a result, it does have these points where people do stop watching it, but you could stop watching it and be perfectly sort of happy. And then the other one is, and the thing is, the show was cancelled before and probably will be again, and hopefully it will keep getting brought back, but you know, there's always the risk that it will be cancelled and just end on a really bad note, which I mean probably will be the case if it's getting cancelled. But yeah, then the other one is Torchwood, which is again fantastic show, and series 3 they did something completely new with it and did like a 5-part like mini series effectively, which is like some of the best television that's ever been produced, and works as an ending to the show, and then they brought it back a few years later for an America season, and then ended that on like a massive cliffhanger and had all these threads that they set up for like the next series, and then they just never did any more of it, and now never will. And it's just like, what? Like, why would you do that? Like, yeah.
That's cruel.
That one's infuriating. Are there any that you have?
So one, and all I'm going to say is the title of the show, and that is Lost. And I'm not going to say any more. I'm sure you're aware of some of the kind of whispers about the finale and stuff. So, yeah. In several years' time, when you've watched it, because in fairness, it's a long show, and it takes it takes effort at some points. So yeah, it would be interesting to discuss once you've seen it, but it's one that I just wanted to mention.
Fair. Yeah, you can not.
Yeah. And then another one is Grey's Anatomy. I talk about it all the time, and I just feel like it's getting to the stage now where, like, there's a running joke that Meredith and Alex were the only ones left from the first season, and now Alex is left, so Meredith was the only one left, and then they've announced that she's leaving, so the Grey of Grey's Anatomy is no longer going to be in the show. Like it's time to call it a day.
Yeah. Hang up the stethoscope.
Yeah, I feel like the time to end it was like around season 10, which was
what
when...
season are they on now?
19.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I feel like that was the moment when Christina left, and it felt, that's when it started to feel like a different show.
Yeah.
Because the reason you were watching it in the beginning was because of their little group of interns and their friendships and their relationships and stuff like that, and especially like Christina and Meredith, that was them. They were like soulmates, they're besties. And then for her to leave and for the show to continue for another 9 seasons, and obviously it was Sandra Oh, so she's on to bigger, like, different things, do you know what I mean? So she can't come back just when it would be relevant for the story for Christina to be there. So there were points where, like, Christina should have been there. It didn't make sense that she wasn't there. So, like, when Derek died, she would have turned up, do you know what I mean? But she wasn't there. And it just felt ridiculous. Like, it felt like it wasn't there because Sandra Oh was busy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, actually. That's kind of one of the things that happens to shows, isn't it, when they suddenly replace characters and actors have to leave and stuff, and it does... I struggle to think of any examples where it doesn't... There aren't points where it does feel, like you say, you're just thinking, like, in the like, logic of the show's world, why is this character not here? Like, they absolutely would be.
Yeah, exactly. And then towards where they are now, they kind of replaced her with, like, texts on a screen. So, like, it's meant to be that Meredith's texting her all the time. But I feel like they had such a perfect way to end, and that would be... I don't know how much you know about the show, but obviously a major part of the beginning of the show was that Meredith's mum had early onset Alzheimer's, and she had kept that a secret, and it kind of started, she was in the nursing home, blah, blah, blah. So, the perfect way to end it 9 seasons ago would have been for it to appear like a normal episode, and then so, like, Christina appears and you think, that's cool, Christina's back for an episode, and then Izzy appears, you think, that's back, and then this kind of goes on and on until you realise that it cannot be real because half the people that are back are now dead, and then the big reveal is that Meredith is in the same nursing home that her mum was in, and she's got early onset Alzheimer's. Boom, end it there.
Yeah.
That would have been such a good way to end it, to wrap it up, to bring it round, so that, because that's a whole thing in the show, that Meredith's so para that she's gonna develop early onset Alzheimer's. Obviously a running joke of the show is that everyone dies. They call the hospital, like, Seattle Grace Mercy Death. So it would be a nice way to kind of tie that in, to bring everyone in. Yeah, and I feel like that would have been peak way to end the show, but instead they're just running on endlessly with all these new groups of interns that, in fairness, it works sometimes, but it takes like 2 seasons for you to warm up to the new characters, do you know what I mean? And it needs to end.
Please. She's doing so many other shows as well, like, just let this one.
Yeah, and I'm like, Grey's could end and you could create another medical show, do you know what I mean, with a new group of interns. It could just be a different spin-off, it could be a different hospital. Like, you could do it, Shonda. It doesn't need to be Grey's, you can make something different, but yeah.
Yeah, and a spin-off would be, I feel like, with not having absolutely no stake in this at all, I feel like a spin-off would be more, like, it would be more interesting if they wrapped up and then they were like, okay, now we're going to do a spin-off, because then it feels a bit more fresh and exciting, and I feel like you're a lot more like welcoming to, like, a new cast of characters in that context, whereas, like, when it's the main show and you have new characters come in, I feel like there's a bit of, like, a wall you put up where you're a bit like, whoa, you're not the characters that I started watching this for.
And when you watched Grey's, that's happened like 3 or 4 times by this point as well. And having watched 19 seasons of the show, that you're gonna start to like the characters, and then they're gonna kill them off, or they're gonna leave. So part of that's like, why am I even bothering having any kind of feelings for this character? Do you know what I mean? But yeah, we could do a whole podcast on Grey's. But I did another one I wanted to mention was, I don't know how many examples you've got of this. There was a few that I had, but it was kind of difficult to come up with. But like a best finale of a cancelled show. Obviously, you said sometimes it could be difficult because if the show's cancelled, generally it's because it's been not well received, or not very many people are watching it. So yeah, do you have any examples for something like that?
I mean, again, one we've talked about before, but you can't not mention it, because it's happened several times, and it's handled it, I think, increasingly with increasing success, and that's Futurama. Where it just no show knows how to get cancelled. Futurama absolutely nail it. So yeah, that is kind of like the best one I think you're ever gonna get. Especially it being an animated show, and animated shows not really having endings, and that one having several, is just such an interesting thing. But yeah, so that's one. Another one is the BBC did a Robin Hood TV series like forever ago, and I remember watching it and really digging it. And season 3 was a bit of a drop in quality. Like season 3, they just did some. They made some choices that weren't amazing. The writing definitely felt like a lot weaker. But then again, it has these like the last. I think it's like the last it was like 13 episode season. I think the last like 3 episodes suddenly got like super interesting. And then it's weird because they do. You watch the last episode and it very much feels like the last episode of the show. But I remember at the time reading that they'd renewed it for a 4th series, and then I think after the fact. I think they renewed it for a 4th series, and a lot of the actors weren't coming back, but some of them were, and then it just slowly like became a thing that it actually got cancelled. It was really weird. But yeah, so that kind of just accidentally had like an ending, but an ending that works really, really well. So that was one I wanted to shout out. Westworld, we obviously did a whole podcast on that. I know.
Westworld was one of my choices as well. But...
but like thankfully it does end on a note. It does kind of work, as it does bring things full circle, and does kind of. I am gutted that we don't get to see how they would have actually ended it, but at least it doesn't end on a terrible note.
I feel like had it ended after season 3, I'd have been disappointed.
Yeah.
So at least they had season 4.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. A bit of redemption, and then without spoiling anything, because I know that's something you're going to watch eventually. Angel, and I wanted to bring this up just because I watched it not knowing that Angel had been cancelled, and the way that it kind of works, because obviously Angel, for anyone doesn't know, is a spin-off series of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but Angel started about halfway through Buffy's entire run, and then there is like a sort of like, they take place. The order kind of switches, like which takes place first and second, but the last series of Angel came out after Buffy was done. So the last series of Angel is effectively the last series set in that whole like universe with those, with characters that are in it and stuff like that. And so I had gone into the last episode in particular, but the last series, thinking, okay, this is. I'd obviously knew that it was where it all ended. But I didn't realise that they didn't know that when they were making it. And they did get the chance, I'm pretty sure, because I think it was cancelled midway through them making the last series. So, or I think they said it was potentially going to get cancelled. I think it wasn't guaranteed to be renewed or something like that. So they do give it an ending, but it just didn't. I had thought it was going to be a proper ending, but it leaves off. Yeah, it left off on a note that just didn't. I felt like there should have been more. Okay. So yeah, again, being as vague as possible.
I know. I appreciate it. Thank you.
But I genuinely feel like I wish I'd known going into it that it was going to be like that, because I had expected something different than what I got effectively. But yeah, and then I guess another to not that I should really be shouting about, but another Joss Whedon one that was cancelled, but then they actually did get to sort of pay off, was Firefly, where that just was cancelled, and the last episode of that doesn't really work as a conclusion at all, because there's loads of threads left hanging. But then they got to come back and make a movie, and the movie is utterly fantastic. So that, and I had the weird experience of watching the movie before watching the TV show.
Okay.
Yeah, which is always, I think that's why I don't love Firefly the way that like so many people do, because it had this really weird, it felt really cheap and really strange seeing all these characters that I knew how they all ended and where they all ended up, and I was used to that universe having like a movie budget and a movie feel, to suddenly watching like a really cheap sci-fi series from like the very early 2000s. But yeah, those are mine. Do you have ones?
So obviously one of mine was Westworld. And like we spoke about it in the episode, it does have that nice kind of full circle moment where it ends where it began, with the train pulling into the park. So it
very
did.
Westworld.
Yes, it very much did work as a season and a series finale, but disappointed that they didn't get to finish it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Another one I wanted to mention, because I didn't realise it was quite as long ago until I was looking at it today. It was Pushing Daisies. Did you ever watch it?
I watched the first like couple episodes and really, really liked it, and I've just always meant to go back to it, but it's never. I don't think I've ever seen it on like any streaming thing.
No.
So I've never seen it just because I haven't had the means to.
That's fair. I think when I watched it as it was airing, and then
really?
Yeah,
what did it air on?
I think it was like ITV. It was on.
Good for them.
That's where I watched it, and then my friend, at the time, she bought the box set. It must have been HMV or whatever. That's how long ago it was.
HMV still exists.
Yeah, but like you don't go into HMV and buy box sets anymore, do you?
Yeah, true.
Yeah, so I feel like that was such a... I loved it at the time. Like, it was so good. It was so weird and quirky, and really, really funny as well. And then, even to this day, I'm a little bit like jaded that it ended. Do you know what I mean? Like, at the time, like, I couldn't understand, like, there wasn't any particular drop in quality or anything like that. I couldn't understand why it was cancelled. It was obviously just people weren't watching it. But there was like a kind of...
There's two series, aren't there?
Yeah. So it's
interesting, because it obviously had an audience for it to get a second series, but then where'd they all go?
Yeah. So it was funny because the episode it ended on like a massive big kind of cliffhanger, but at the same time it also worked as a series finale. I don't know, I didn't read into it enough, obviously. I don't know whether they knew it was ending before it was cancelled, kind of thing. But yeah, it's another one that would have been nice to see, because the kind of reveal at the end would have changed the entire show. Do you know what I mean? Like, so yeah, that's one I'm still always a little bit angry about. And yeah, the kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about was, obviously we've spoken a lot about seasons of shows, but in particular I wanted to just discuss briefly like single series shows, and how maybe how they should end, if you had any examples of you, like your favorite ones or things like that, because it's such a difficult one, I thought, thinking about it, because it's a weird one, because if you know it's going to be like a one season thing, you're going to have the story all set out, whereas if you go in not knowing how many seasons you're going to get and things like that, or if you've planned for 3 seasons and then get renewed for 5 or whatever, you're going to have to adapt your story. But if it's a one season thing, surely you're going to go in knowing what your ending's going to be.
Yeah, that was kind of the biggest point I had to make, was that on the whole, a one-off series, like a mini-series, limited series, you know, you don't really tend to see them mess up their ending. I mean, I mentioned years and years before, like, but it's not as often seen and done because, like you say, like, you know, basically you're writing the finale at the same kind of time you're writing the first episode, so there's no, you know, there's no change in cast, there's no change in writers, there's no change in any of these things and mandates and, you know, audience in theory, like it is just you're concluding the story that you set up and you can make all the connections you want. So generally they seem to they have it a lot easier.
Yeah.
But that's why, you know, limited miniseries and stuff like that are so good, I think, and so interesting, and why they're so that's the whole sort of appeal in watching them, because you know you can trust that they are going to end well, because it is just like a contained story and it's saying what it needs to say and not staying on too long. So there's no sort of fluff or filler. Yeah. So I think that, yeah, I think usually you'll find them to be more like series finales as well. Season finales as well, actually, in the sense that you usually the last episode there will be the most dramatic and sort of high stakes and maybe bombastic, because again, it's you only get the one run of episodes, so they are going to have like a bigger scale final episode.
Yeah, like that's going to be like your one shot kind of thing, isn't it?
Exactly, and you don't usually the sort of more intimate, quieter series finales that long running shows do or have. They've earned that by having like so many big bombastic finales. But when you've not ever had a finale at all, then yeah, you would just kind of have like your last episode be the big one, effectively. And then yeah, for some examples, I've got a couple of examples. Chernobyl is an obvious one. Which, have you seen Chernobyl?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very bleak show, but yeah, it does end very on like again. It just, I mean, it's consistent with every other episode basically, and that it's very good.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't watch the last episode and think that was way better than the rest or way worse than the rest. It was just like on par with the rest, which was excellent. This one's a bit of a cheat, and I have mentioned it before. But Fleabag, because when that first series was written, it was written as a one-off. I mean, it was an adaptation of a play, which is a self-contained story, and then the first series was just done as, you know, okay, she's going to adapt the play to TV, and then she did it, and she was like, cool, I'm going to leave it. That's, you know, I don't have anything more to say here. Only she then found out she did, and it was a few years later she came back and she had this idea and she developed the second series, and the second series, you know, while continuing the story and characters, it is kind of its own thing. It does feel like, while building on what's there, it does feel like series one does wrap, it does conclude things, and then series two does again. So that one is a cheat, but I also do feel like it's worth mentioning.
Fair.
And then another one, since I was giving Russell T Davies grief for years and years before, I have to shout out It's a Sin. Which, have you seen It's a Sin?
Yeah. I watched it as it was airing, actually.
Yeah.
Which is rare for me, because as you well know, I just it's not my done thing.
Yeah. But yeah, that last episode, I mean, every episode of that is phenomenal as well. But what that last episode does with its characters and sort of, yeah, that whole sequence with like the mum in the hospital and just where they suddenly start taking that episode. I remember just watching it and I was like, oh my god, this was already, I was like, this is, you know, one of the best shows I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And then for it to just like, it actually does step up to another level on that last episode, and just delivers in like so many ways. Yeah, so that was one that I feel like has to be mentioned.
Yeah.
What about yourself?
I think one that I wanted to mention, obviously we've spoken about it before, The Devil's Hour. That's also a little bit of a cheat now because it's been renewed, but
yeah, that was actually why I didn't mention that one, because of the renewal.
Yeah, it was like we said in the whatever episode it was, we were talking about, like, it's probably one of the best like season or series finales that I've seen. Like, it was just, I can't think of another time where I've watched a TV show, like a final episode, and just been blown away and been like, wow, That was amazing. That makes so much sense. So yeah, just wanted to give that a shout out again. And then the other one, this is also a bit of a cheat, but I will justify it. And that is, I don't know if you've seen it. It's like a docu-series called The Jinx.
No. I don't really know anything about it.
No, it's Andrew Jarecki that did it, who also did Capturing the Freedmans. I don't know if you've seen that either.
No.
It's a feature length, but so this one is about this guy called Robert Durst, who's accused of, I can't remember how many people. I think it's maybe a wife and an ex-wife or something that he's accused of, like they've died under mysterious circumstances, blah blah. And the reason I'm including this one is because obviously you would think the documentary it's obviously real life, etc. But you and I know from studying and whatnot that it's even something like a documentary is structured, and generally they'll have like an outline of, like in this case, an outline of episodes, what each episode's going to cover. And when you think about them like that, there's a very definite structure for docu-series, so the ending is not an accident, and that's my justification for this. So the ending of this one basically is, there's, in the kind of final moments, he's interviewing the guy Robert Durst, and then he doesn't realise that he's still being recorded.
Wait, I have seen this.
Yeah, and he goes away away into the bathroom, and he basically confesses, like he thinks he's talking to himself, but it's been caught on the audio recording, whatever they've got on.
That's right, yeah.
And I feel like it's such a perfect way to end the documentary, to be like, here we've presented arguments from both sides, we've spoken to different parties for each side, and then they just end with this like final kind of damning bit of evidence, like, and then that's it. It finishes like, no, that, like, that's on you to decide what your thoughts on that are.
I completely forgot I'd seen that. Yeah, and it's played, like you say, it's played so beautifully because it's like a total ace in the hole card that it has, and it doesn't, normally with these sorts of things, I feel like I don't really watch a lot of documentaries, but from my understanding of them, I feel like the show would be hyping that fact up, and you would know about it way in advance, and it'd be telegraphed. But the fact that, like you say, it's presented in this sort of balanced way, and then it's like, well, by the way,
and
it just makes it's like such a mic drop, isn't it?
And it's such like a very considered choice as well. Like he could have chosen, like you're saying, to put that at the start, and then everything you see after that is kind of swayed by that, or he could have just fired it, like it could have been a cliffhanger. Do you know what I mean? But the fact that he's put it right at the end just is like perfect timing.
And it literally recontextualizes everything. In such an interesting way. So that's a very, very good choice.
Thank you. I thought I would cheat a little bit.
Well, I did, so it's only fair.
Yeah, fair. So thank you again, Sam, as always, for joining me. Super interesting points and choices and things.
And curveball questions as well.
Curveball questions, I know. So that's us. That was our season finale for season 2.
Yeah.
So we're going to be changing up a little bit in season 3. I won't say too much about it now. I'll let Sam, you can take it away when we get on to season 3. Yeah. But we're going to be changing it up a little bit, doing some things a little bit differently. The one thing I'll say just now is that the frequency of them is going to change slightly, so it'll drop down to once a month. But hopefully that'll be paid off. I think that's all we've got to say about all that there is to be said about TV has been covered.
That's it.
That's it.
Definitively. 24 hours of non-stop talking.
Exactly. But no, Sam, again, thank you for joining me as always.
Thank you.
Always appreciate your insight and
thank you for the last 2 days.
Yeah, exactly. The 2 straight days. Can you imagine? So yeah, we'll be coming back with season 3 in March time. So yeah, guys, until then, we'll see.
Yeah.